The moment I stepped into my commanding officer's office and saw the old man from the gas station sitting there in a perfectly pressed uniform with 4 silver stars on his shoulders, my first thought was that I had walked into the wrong room. 4 stars. In the army, that kind of rank doesn't just belong to somebody important. It belongs to somebody whose decisions ripple across bases, across commands, across people's lives. My commander was standing beside his desk, unusually still, his face giving nothing away. The old man turned and looked at me with the same quiet eyes I remembered from 7 days earlier, when he had been counting coins for a hot dog. Then he said my name, Staff Sergeant Carter. And just like that, every thought in my head went silent. To understand how I ended up standing in that office at Fort Cavazos, trying not to stare at a 4-star general who had once been short $1 at a gas station outside Dallas, you have to go back a week earlier to a long hot Thursday that had already worn me down before the sun even started to fall. Life in uniform has a way of stretching certain days until they feel twice their actual length. That had been one of those days. Nothing dramatic had happened. No emergency, no crisis. Just the kind of steady grind that can drain a person more thoroughly than chaos ever could. Equipment logs, vehicle readiness reports, a surprise change in scheduling from battalion, a stack of paperwork that kept growing every time I thought I'd reached the bottom. By the time I signed out, the muscles between my shoulders were tight, and the bridge of my nose ached from staring too long at screens and forms and inventory sheets. I was assigned to a logistics unit outside the Dallas area then, and late afternoons had a look all their own. North Texas light can be hard and gold at the same time. Everything seems coated in heat, even the shadows. The wind doesn't really cool you off, it just moves the warmth around. When I drove out through the gate that evening, the road ahead shimmered a little above the pavement, and the sky had that faded, washed blue color that comes after a day of full sun. I wasn't ready to go straight home. Some evenings after a day spent inside motor pools and supply rooms and administrative buildings, I needed 10 or 15 quiet minutes somewhere in between. Not home, not base, just a place where nobody needed anything from me. There was a small gas station and convenience store off a service road outside the city, maybe 20 minutes from post if traffic behaved. It sat beside a 2-lane stretch of road bordered by scrub grass and utility poles, with a faded sign out front and a parking lot full of dust and old oil stains. The kind of place where ranch hands, truckers, cops, and soldiers all passed through sooner or later. I pulled in beside an older Ford pickup with sun-bleached paint and sat for a moment with the engine off. The air conditioner clicked into silence. Outside, I could hear the hum of traffic from the highway and the faint rattle of a loose metal sign somewhere near the ice machine. When I stepped out, the heat hit me again, carrying the smell of gasoline, hot concrete, and something salty and fried drifting from inside. The store was cool in that overworked, fluorescent way only convenience stores ever are. Harsh white light, scuffed tile, a soft drink cooler humming along the back wall, a roller grill near the counter turning hot dogs that had probably been sitting there longer than they ought to. There were maybe 5 people inside. A man in work boots buying chewing tobacco, a woman with 2 kids arguing over candy, a teenager in a baseball cap filling a giant cup with ice. Nothing unusual. I grabbed a bottled water and a black coffee from the machine near the back. The coffee was stronger than it had any right to be, which was exactly why I wanted it. As I came up toward the register, I noticed an older man already standing there. He was wearing a faded cap with veteran stitched across the front in gold thread, the kind of cap you see all over Texas. The brim had softened with age, and the fabric had darkened where fingers had touched it over the years. He wore jeans clean but worn thin at the knees, and a light denim shirt rolled neatly at the cuffs. His shoulders had that unmistakable posture some men keep long after their service days are behind them. Not stiff exactly, just straight in a way that suggested habit-discipline memory. On the counter in front of him sat a wrapped hot dog and a small paper cup for coffee. The cashier, a young woman with tired eyes and a name tag that read Marissa, gave him a patient little smile. "I'm sorry, sir," she said. "You're $1 short." The man looked down at the coins in his palm as if maybe he'd missed one the first time. He didn't get angry, didn't look embarrassed exactly, just quiet. The kind of quiet that lands heavier than a complaint. "Well," he said after a moment in a low, calm voice, "I suppose I counted wrong?" He began sorting through the coins again. Pennies, nickels, dimes, a few quarters. I remember the sound they made on the counter, small, metallic, almost too loud for the size of the moment. Nobody in the store said anything, but people noticed. You can feel when a room shifts its attention. It had. Maybe that was the part that bothered me most. Not the missing dollar, not the hot dog. Just the fact that a man old enough to have served his country decades earlier was standing under fluorescent lights, counting change while strangers pretended not to watch. I stepped forward before I had time to think too much about it and set a dollar bill on the counter. "Put it with his," I said. The cashier blinked, relieved. "You sure?" "Yes, ma'am." The old man turned and looked at me. Up close I could see the lines in his face more clearly. Not soft lines, Texas lines. Weather time, years of work, years of sunlight. His eyes were steady and alert. "You don't have to do that," he said. "It's fine," I told him. "Go ahead." Marissa rang it up before the conversation could turn into one of those polite little arguments that make everybody uncomfortable. The old man kept looking at me for a second longer, not suspicious, not overly grateful, just thoughtful. "You serving?" he asked. "Yes, sir." "Army?" "Yes, sir." He gave one slow nod like that confirmed something for him. "Well, thank you." I shrugged a little and shifted my coffee in my hand, just returning the favor. A faint smile touched the corner of his mouth. "Favor?" "Veterans look out for each other," I said, "or they should." He held my gaze for a moment, and there was something unusual in it then. Not surprise exactly, more like interest, as if I'd said something he intended to remember. "What's your name, Sergeant?" "Staff Sergeant Anna Carter." He repeated it quietly. "Anna Carter." "Yes, sir." "Well," he said, picking up his coffee and hot dog, "good to meet you, Staff Sergeant Carter." I nodded, once paid for my own things, and headed for the door before he could say much else. I wasn't trying to be noble. I wasn't trying to create a moment. Truthfully, I was tired, hungry, and already thinking about the next morning's workload. By the time I got back into my truck, set my coffee in the cup holder, and pulled out onto the road, the whole thing had already started to slide into the background of the day. That was the strange part. It hadn't felt important. Just $1, just a hot dog, just an older veteran at a roadside gas station outside Dallas. I drove home with the radio low, and the Texas sky turning amber behind me, thinking about dispatch schedules and maintenance reports, and whether I'd remembered to answer one email before leaving. I did not spend that drive wondering who the old man really was. I did not imagine that 7 days later I would walk into headquarters and find him waiting for me in dress uniform, 4 stars bright on his shoulders, while my commanding officer watched from the side of the room like something serious had already been set in motion. At the time, it was nothing more than a passing act of courtesy. At least that's what I thought. The next morning began the way most mornings did, on base, early, structured, and louder than a person might prefer before their first cup of coffee had time to settle. The sun had barely crept over the horizon when I drove through the gate again. Texas mornings carry a different kind of quiet than evenings. The air is cooler, the sky still pale, and for a short while everything feels suspended between rest and motion. But inside a military installation, that quiet rarely lasts long. By the time I parked near the logistics building, engines were already running in the motor pool, and the first wave of soldiers had started their morning routines. Boots on pavement, radios crackling, a forklift whining somewhere behind the supply warehouse. It's the sort of rhythm you stop noticing after a while, like background music in a place where work never really pauses. I grabbed my coffee and walked inside. Our section handled transportation and equipment readiness vehicles, inventory logs, dispatch schedules, maintenance coordination. Not glamorous work, but the Army runs on things most people never see. Trucks have to be fueled, tires replaced, parts ordered, reports filed. Somebody has to make sure the machines that move people and supplies actually function when they're needed. That somebody more often than not was us. The building smelled faintly of dust printer toner and industrial cleaner. I had just set my bag down when Sergeant Morales looked up from his desk and gave me a sympathetic grin. "You look like you wrestled a bear last night," he said. "Just paperwork," I told him. He laughed quietly. "Same thing." The morning passed in the usual blur of tasks. Dispatch records, maintenance reports, an unexpected email from battalion requesting updated readiness numbers by noon. Nothing dramatic, just the steady churn of administrative work that keeps units moving. Around mid-morning, though, the atmosphere shifted. You can usually tell when something changes in a command structure. It's not always loud. Sometimes it's just the way people talk a little more carefully, or the way conversations stop when certain names are mentioned. That morning, the name circulating quietly through our section was Colonel Nathan Briggs. Briggs had arrived at the installation just a few weeks earlier, transferring in from another command. Officially, he was responsible for overseeing operational readiness across several support units, including ours. On paper, his record looked immaculate. Strong evaluations, efficient performance metrics, clean administrative reports. But inside the building, people spoke about him in a different tone. Not openly, not loudly. Just carefully. Sergeant Morales leaned over the partition between our desks that morning and lowered his voice a little. "You heard the colonel's making rounds today?" I shook my head. "First I've heard of it." "Well," he said dryly, "you'll know when he gets here." "What's that supposed to mean?" Morales glanced toward the hallway, then back at me. "Let's just say he's thorough." Thorough, that was the word people used. In the Army, thorough can mean many things. Sometimes it means disciplined leadership and attention to detail. Other times it means a person who treats every small error like a courtroom case. Within a few days of Briggs arriving, stories had started circulating. A mechanic written up for logging a maintenance time 10 minutes late. A junior specialist formally reprimanded for mislabeling a parts crate. A supply clerk forced to redo an entire inventory report because one serial number had been typed incorrectly. None of those things were catastrophic mistakes. But each one had been documented officially. The thing about paperwork in the military is that it accumulates. A single report might not mean much. A pattern of reports, though, that can shape a career. At first, Briggs didn't pay much attention to me. I kept my head down, did my job, and focused on making sure our numbers stayed accurate. Logistics work is rarely glamorous, but it rewards precision. If the reports are right, the system runs smoothly. Unfortunately, it only takes one small crack in that system for someone like Briggs to notice. That crack appeared 3 days after the gas station incident. I was finishing a vehicle readiness report when the email arrived. Subject report to Colonel Briggs, 1400 hours. No explanation, just the instruction. When a message like that lands in your inbox, your brain starts replaying the last few days automatically. Every report, every conversation, every number you entered into a form. Had I missed something? At exactly 2 o'clock that afternoon, I knocked on the door of Colonel Briggs's office. "Enter." His office looked exactly the way you'd expect. Neat desk, perfectly aligned paperwork, framed commendations on the wall, everything arranged with careful precision. Briggs sat behind the desk reviewing a document. He didn't look up immediately. "Staff Sergeant Carter," he said calmly. "Yes, sir." He slid a printed report across the desk toward me. "Do you believe accuracy matters in this organization?" "Yes, sir." He tapped the paper lightly with a finger. "There is an error in this vehicle dispatch log." I looked down. It took about 3 seconds to see it. One vehicle identification number had been entered with 2 digits reversed. The sort of mistake that normally takes 10 seconds to correct. "I can fix that immediately, sir." Briggs leaned back slightly in his chair. "That isn't the point." The tone in his voice stayed calm. That made the conversation worse somehow. People shouting can be argued with. Calm authority is harder to push against. In this command, he continued attention to detail reflects discipline. "Yes, sir." He watched me for a moment, then made a note on the document. "I will be placing a minor administrative observation in your record." My stomach tightened. "Sir," I said carefully, "the error doesn't affect vehicle readiness. The dispatch data is still accurate." "That may be," Briggs replied, "but documentation errors indicate a pattern of inattentiveness if left unaddressed." Pattern. That word hung in the air longer than the conversation required. When I walked out of that office 15 minutes later, I had the distinct feeling that something small had just become something larger. Over the next few days, the pattern became clearer. Additional inspections. Requests for revised reports. Questions about procedures that had never been questioned before. None of it crossed the line into obvious harassment. Briggs was too careful for that. Everything he did could be justified under the umbrella of maintaining standards. But the effect on the unit was noticeable. People spoke more quietly. Double-checked every form 3 times. The motor pool, which had always carried a steady undercurrent of jokes and casual conversations between soldiers, grew quieter. One evening, as we were locking up for the day, Morales caught up with me near the parking lot. "You doing all right?" he asked. "I'm fine." He studied my face for a moment. "You're on his radar." "That obvious?" Morales nodded slowly. "Briggs doesn't yell," he said. "He documents." I leaned against my truck door and sighed. "What's the end game?" Morales shrugged. "Paperwork builds stories," he said, "and the wrong story in a file can follow a soldier for years." I drove home that night with the Texas sky fading from orange to purple over the highway, thinking about that phrase. Paperwork builds stories. What I didn't know yet was that somewhere above our chain of command, someone else had already started reading those stories. And within a week they would bring me face to face with a man I had last seen standing quietly at a gas station counter counting coins for a hot dog. The following week settled over our unit the way heavy weather settles over the Texas plains, slowly at first, then all at once. Nothing about the work itself changed. Trucks still rolled in and out of the motor pool. Maintenance crews still crawled under engines with grease-streaked hands. Dispatch reports still had to be completed before the end of each day. On paper, everything looked normal. But anyone who had spent time in a military unit knows that morale is something you can feel long before you see it documented anywhere. The difference showed up in small ways. Jokes that used to bounce across the maintenance bay during slow moments became quieter, then rarer. Soldiers double-checked forms not once but 3 times before submitting them. Conversations in hallways paused when certain footsteps approached. Colonel Briggs didn't shout. That was the thing everyone noticed first. He didn't storm into rooms or slam desks or bark insults like the caricature of a bad officer you sometimes see in movies. He was calm, controlled, even polite. And yet every time he appeared in the motor pool, the atmosphere tightened a little. I saw it the following Monday morning. I was standing near the dispatch desk reviewing vehicle readiness numbers when the door to the maintenance bay opened. Conversations lowered immediately, not because anyone had been told to stop talking, but because people instinctively sensed when someone with authority entered the room. Briggs walked in wearing a neatly pressed uniform that somehow remained spotless, even in a building that smelled permanently of oil and diesel. "Carry on," he said calmly. That phrase in theory means continue working as normal. In practice, nobody quite does. He walked slowly through the bay, pausing occasionally to look over maintenance logs or glance at a vehicle inspection sheet clipped to a clipboard. When he reached the dispatch desk, his eyes shifted toward me. "Staff Sergeant Carter." "Yes, sir." "Vehicle readiness report." I handed him the clipboard. He studied the document for a moment, then flipped to the second page. "How long has Vehicle 214 been listed as pending maintenance?" 2 days, sir. Replacement brake assembly is scheduled for installation tomorrow." He nodded slightly, then handed the clipboard back. "Ensure the repair timeline is reflected accurately in the weekly readiness update." "Yes, sir." The exchange lasted less than 30 seconds. But when he walked away, I noticed 3 soldiers nearby quietly exhale. That was how Briggs operated. Nothing explosive. Just constant pressure. Over the next several days, that pressure increased. It started with small things. A request for additional clarification on a supply report. A memo asking why a maintenance log entry had been submitted 15 minutes later than scheduled. A directive requiring that dispatch records include expanded documentation fields that had never previously been necessary. Individually, none of those requests violated regulations. Together, they created an environment where every soldier felt as though they were being evaluated every minute of the day. One afternoon, I was reviewing equipment inventory when Sergeant Morales stopped beside my desk again. "You got a minute?" "Sure." He leaned against the edge of the table and lowered his voice. "Briggs asked for 3 additional reports from the maintenance teams today." "What kind of reports?" "Duplicate readiness summaries." I frowned. "We already send those to battalion." "Exactly." I sat back in my chair. "Why ask for duplicates?" Morales shrugged. "Because he can." He paused, then added quietly, "Word is he did the same thing at his last command." "How'd that turn out?" Morales gave a humorless half-smile. "Let's just say a lot of people transferred." The pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. Briggs rarely raised his voice. But he documented everything. A clerical typo became a written observation. A scheduling delay became a formal note in a performance review. A maintenance backlog caused by parts shortages suddenly appeared in weekly reports as inefficient workflow. The cumulative effect was subtle but powerful. People worked harder. But they also worked more cautiously. And cautious soldiers often make fewer mistakes, but they also take fewer initiative-driven actions. That shift in mindset is something experienced leaders notice immediately. Apparently someone had. Late Thursday afternoon, exactly 1 week after the gas station incident, I was reviewing the weekly readiness update when Sergeant Morales appeared in the doorway again. This time he didn't look casual. "Harris," he said quietly. "Yes. Headquarters just called." The tone in his voice made my stomach tighten. "What about—" "They want you to report immediately." "Did they say why?" Morales shook his head. "No explanation. There are certain phrases in the Army that carry weight no matter how many years you've served. Report immediately is one of them. It means someone higher in the chain of command wants answers. And when that happens without warning, your mind begins replaying every recent event with uncomfortable clarity." I shut down my computer and grabbed my notebook. The walk to headquarters wasn't long, maybe 5 minutes across the base courtyard, but it felt longer that afternoon. The Texas sun had begun its slow descent toward evening, casting long shadows across the pavement. Soldiers crossed the courtyard in small groups, carrying toolboxes or radios, talking about weekend plans. Normal life continued around me. But inside my head, a quiet tension had begun building. Had Briggs escalated something? Filed additional documentation. Requested a formal review. Administrative actions rarely begin with dramatic confrontations. Most start with quiet meetings in offices where paperwork decides outcomes. The headquarters building stood near the center of the installation, a solid brick structure with tall windows and a large American flag snapping gently in the wind out front. Inside, the air smelled faintly of floor polish and old paper. A receptionist sat behind the front desk. "Staff Sergeant Carter." "Yes, ma'am." She gestured down the hallway. "Go right in." That answer didn't make me feel any better. I walked down the corridor, my boots echoing softly against the tile floor. The walls held framed photographs of past commanders and unit achievements. Everything about the building conveyed order and history. When I reached the office door at the end of the hallway, I paused for half a second. Then I knocked. "Enter." I opened the door and stepped inside. My commanding officer stood beside his desk. And sitting calmly in the chair across from him was the old man from the gas station. Except this time he wasn't wearing faded denim and a veteran's cap. He was wearing a perfectly pressed army dress uniform. 4 silver stars rested on his shoulders. And suddenly the memory of a dollar bill on a convenience store counter didn't feel quite so simple anymore. When you're a staff sergeant walking into headquarters unexpectedly, you learn very quickly that the room tells you almost everything you need to know before a single word is spoken. That office told me a lot. First, my commanding officer wasn't sitting behind the desk like usual. He was standing beside it, arms loosely folded, watching me with an expression that was neutral enough to reveal nothing. Officers who expect a routine conversation don't stand like that. Second, the man in the chair had his back straight in a way I had only seen in photographs and ceremonies. His uniform was immaculate, pressed so sharply that the creases looked almost permanent. The ribbons on his chest were arranged in long, precise rows. And on his shoulders rested 4 stars that caught the light from the window behind him. 4-star generals are not people you casually run into during the middle of an ordinary workday. I stopped 2 steps inside the office and snapped to attention. "Staff Sergeant Anna Carter reporting as ordered, sir." For a moment the room was completely still. Then the general leaned back slightly in his chair and studied me the same way he had studied the coins in his palm a week earlier at the gas station. Except now I knew who I was looking at. "Staff Sergeant Carter," he said calmly, at ease. His voice carried that particular tone some senior leaders develop after decades of command, quiet, measured, and completely certain of itself. I relaxed slightly, though my heart was beating faster than I cared to admit. My commanding officer gestured toward the chair across from the general. "Have a seat, Carter." That alone felt unusual. Enlisted soldiers do not typically sit during meetings with generals unless specifically invited to do so. I sat carefully, keeping my posture straight, and my hands resting on my knees. The general watched me for another moment before speaking again. "Do you recognize me, Sergeant?" There was no point pretending otherwise. "Yes, sir." He tilted his head slightly. "From where?" "The gas station outside Dallas, sir." A faint smile touched the corner of his mouth. "That's correct." My commanding officer finally spoke. "Staff Sergeant Carter," he said, "this is General William Harding." The name hit me immediately. Harding wasn't just any general. He commanded one of the major operational divisions overseeing several installations across the region. His name appeared in official briefings, policy updates, and command announcements that filtered down through the Army structure. In other words, he was the kind of officer whose decisions affected tens of thousands of soldiers. And 1 week earlier I had handed him $1 at a convenience store so he could buy a hot dog. The realization still felt surreal. General Harding rested his hands calmly on the desk. "You left rather quickly that evening," he said. "Yes, sir." "Why?" The question caught me slightly off guard. "It didn't seem like a big situation, sir." He raised an eyebrow. "Helping a stranger pay for food isn't a big situation." "No, sir." "Why not?" I considered my answer for a moment. "Because he was a veteran, sir." Harding's eyes remained fixed on mine. "And that was enough." "Yes, sir." Silence settled briefly over the room. Then Harding nodded slowly. "That's what I thought." He reached down and lifted a thin folder from the desk. "I travel to installations across the country several times a year," he said calmly. "Sometimes officially, sometimes less visibly." I listened carefully. When soldiers know a general is visiting, Harding continued, things tend to change. Floors are polished twice. Reports become perfect. Conversations become rehearsed. My commanding officer gave a small knowing nod beside the desk. Harding tapped the folder lightly with one finger. "Occasionally I prefer to see how things function when no one believes they're being observed." The realization started to form slowly in my mind. "You were evaluating the installation, sir." "In a manner of speaking." He opened the folder. Inside were several printed documents. Personnel evaluations, operational summaries, and something else. My name appeared on one of the pages. I felt my stomach tighten. Staff Sergeant Carter, Harding said calmly, "Are you familiar with Colonel Nathan Briggs?" "Yes, sir." "How would you describe your professional interactions with him?" That question carried more weight than it might seem on the surface. In the Army, criticizing an officer, especially in front of a 4-star general, is not something enlisted soldiers do lightly. But Harding's expression wasn't confrontational. It was patient, like someone genuinely waiting for an honest answer. I chose my words carefully. "Professional, sir." The general's smile returned slightly. "That's a diplomatic answer." My commanding officer spoke quietly. "Carter, this discussion is confidential. Speak freely." I hesitated for a moment. Then I answered honestly. "Sir, Colonel Briggs places significant emphasis on administrative discipline." Harding nodded. "Yes," he said, "I've read the reports." He slid one sheet across the desk toward me. It was the observation Briggs had filed regarding the reversed digits in my dispatch log. Harding studied it again. "Do you believe this report accurately reflects your performance?" I swallowed. "No, sir." Harding leaned back slightly in his chair. "That aligns with my own assessment." The room fell quiet again. Outside the window, I could see soldiers crossing the courtyard carrying equipment between buildings. From this distance, they looked almost like figures in a quiet machine moving steadily through routines that had existed long before any of us arrived. Inside the office, however, something much more deliberate was unfolding. Harding closed the folder. "Staff Sergeant Carter," he said, "there are 2 reasons you're here today." I waited. "First, I wanted to thank you." "For the gas station, sir." "Yes?" He folded his hands together. "You assisted someone you believed to be an elderly veteran experiencing an uncomfortable moment." "Yes, sir." "You did so quietly, without attention, without expecting recognition. It seemed like the right thing to do." Harding nodded again. "That's exactly why it matters." Then his tone shifted slightly. "But that isn't the only reason you're here." My heart rate ticked upward again. Harding turned toward my commanding officer. "Has Colonel Briggs arrived yet?" "Any minute now, sir." The general leaned back calmly in his chair. "Good." A quiet knock sounded on the door. "Enter," my commander said. The door opened. Colonel Nathan Briggs stepped inside. He stopped the moment he saw the general. For the first time since I had met him, the absolute confidence Briggs carried around the motor pool disappeared. "Sir," he said quickly, snapping to attention, "I wasn't aware." Colonel Briggs Harding interrupted gently, "Please have a seat." And in that moment, sitting there between a 4-star general and the officer who had been quietly documenting my every administrative misstep for the past week, I realized something important. This meeting had been planned very carefully, and someone in that room was about to have a very difficult afternoon. Colonel Briggs did not sit down right away. For a brief moment, he simply stood there near the door as if his mind was trying to catch up with the reality in front of him. His eyes moved from General Harding to my commanding officer, then briefly toward me. I could almost see the questions forming behind his expression. Why was a 4-star general here? Why was I here? And why did it look as if this meeting had already begun before he walked into the room? Sir Briggs said carefully, still standing at attention, "I was not informed of a command visit today." General Harding didn't raise his voice. He simply watched Briggs for a moment, the same calm, steady look he had used when asking me about the gas station. Colonel Harding said quietly, "Please close the door." Briggs obeyed immediately. When he returned to the chair across from the desk, Harding gestured slightly. "Have a seat." Briggs sat down stiffly, though his posture remained straight. His hands rested on his knees in the controlled way officers adopt when they know they're being evaluated. For a few seconds, no one spoke. Harding finally broke the silence. "Colonel Briggs," he said, "how long have you been assigned to this installation?" 3 weeks, sir." "And prior to that?" "Fort Lewis, sir." Harding nodded once. "I see." He opened the folder again. The faint rustle of paper seemed louder than usual in the quiet room. Colonel Harding continued calmly, "Are you familiar with the concept of leadership through authority versus leadership through trust?" Briggs straightened slightly. "Yes, sir." "And which do you believe produces the most effective units?" "Both have their place, sir." Harding gave a small nod. "That is a reasonable answer." He slid a document across the desk toward Briggs. I recognized it immediately. The observation report Briggs had filed against me. "Do you recall submitting this?" Harding asked. "Yes, sir." "Explain the situation." Briggs picked up the paper and spoke with measured confidence. "There was an administrative discrepancy in a vehicle dispatch record, sir. I determined corrective documentation was appropriate." Harding leaned back slightly. "Corrective documentation?" "Yes, sir." "Did you speak with Staff Sergeant Carter prior to submitting the report?" Briggs hesitated. "No, sir." "Did the error affect vehicle readiness?" "No, sir." Harding nodded slowly. "Interesting." The word hung in the air. My commanding officer remained silent beside the desk, though his eyes moved carefully between the two men. Harding flipped to another page in the folder. "During my visit to this installation," he said calmly, "I requested operational summaries from several departments." Briggs listened without interrupting. Harding continued. "I also reviewed administrative actions taken during your first 3 weeks here." Briggs shifted slightly in his chair. "Yes, sir." Harding tapped the folder. "I have before me 6 formal observations filed against junior enlisted soldiers during that period." Briggs nodded cautiously. "Corrective leadership, sir." Harding's voice remained perfectly even. "Is that what you call it?" "Yes, sir." Harding slid several additional pages across the desk. 4 written warnings, he continued. Briggs looked down at the documents. The confidence in his posture began to soften slightly. "Colonel Harding said during my visit, I also spoke with several soldiers assigned to your command." Briggs remained silent. Harding's eyes moved briefly toward me. "And I learned something interesting." The room went still again. Harding closed the folder slowly. "A week ago, he said I stopped at a gas station outside Dallas." Briggs frowned faintly. "Yes, sir. My credit card was declined." Briggs blinked. "I see, sir." "And when that happened," Harding continued, "Staff Sergeant Carter quietly paid the difference." Briggs glanced at me again, confusion crossing his face. "That was generous of her, sir." "Yes," Harding said softly, "it was." Another pause followed. Harding leaned forward slightly. "But that is not the reason this meeting was scheduled." Briggs sat very still. Harding opened the folder again. Inside were additional documents, reports I had never seen before. During my review of this installation, Harding said I observed a pattern in your administrative leadership style. Briggs cleared his throat. With respect, sir, discipline sometimes requires firm documentation. Harding nodded. That is true. Then he said something that made the room feel colder. But discipline must also be fair. He tapped the folder again. In several of these cases, the documented errors were minor administrative discrepancies that could have been resolved through direct conversation. Briggs said nothing. Harding continued. Instead, you chose formal documentation. Yes, sir, Briggs said carefully. Accountability is essential. Harding studied him. Colonel Briggs, he said, have you considered that leadership may involve protecting the soldiers under your command rather than documenting their mistakes? Briggs opened his mouth. Closed it. Harding leaned back again. I have served in this army for 37 years, he said calmly. I have commanded units in combat zones and training bases alike. The room remained silent. And during that time, Harding continued, I have learned something about leadership. He paused. One of the clearest measures of a leader is how the people under them feel when that leader enters the room. Briggs's face had grown noticeably paler. Harding closed the folder again. Colonel Briggs, he said, based on the documentation reviewed during this visit, I am recommending that your current operational authority be temporarily suspended pending a command evaluation. Briggs's head snapped upward. Sir? Harding raised one hand gently. The room went silent again. This is not a punishment, Harding said calmly. Briggs said nothing. It is a review. Harding glanced toward my commanding officer. Colonel Daniels will oversee the evaluation process. Yes, Sir, Daniels replied. Harding returned his attention to Briggs. You may return to your quarters for now. Briggs sat still for a moment longer. Then he stood. For the first time since entering the room, he looked directly at me. There was no anger in his eyes, only realization. He straightened his uniform. Permission to leave, sir? Granted. Briggs walked to the door. When it closed behind him, the tension in the room seemed to release all at once. Harding let out a slow breath. Colonel Daniels, he said. Yes, sir. Ensure the review proceeds fairly. Of course. Daniels nodded once and stepped out to begin the necessary calls. The door shut quietly. Now it was just General Harding and me. And the room suddenly felt much larger. For several seconds after the door closed behind Colonel Briggs, the office remained completely quiet. The kind of quiet that settles over a room after something important has already happened, and everyone present understands that the moment carries weight beyond what was spoken out loud. General Harding leaned back slightly in his chair and looked toward the window. Outside, soldiers continued walking across the courtyard between buildings, carrying tool cases, radios, and clipboards. From a distance, their movements looked almost mechanical, small pieces of a machine that never truly stopped running. Bases are like that. Work continues whether people inside the offices are having difficult conversations or not. Harding finally turned his attention back toward me. Staff Sergeant Carter. Yes, sir. He gestured lightly toward the chair again. At ease. I relaxed slightly, though I still sat straight. You've had an unusual afternoon, he said. Yes, sir. He allowed himself a faint smile. That tends to happen when generals start showing up in places where they weren't expected. I nodded carefully. Yes, sir. Harding picked up the coffee cup sitting on the corner of the desk. It had probably been placed there before the meeting started, but he hadn't touched it while Briggs was present. Now he took a slow sip. You know, he said thoughtfully, after enough years in the army, you start to notice patterns. Yes, sir. You see young soldiers arrive full of energy and ambition. He set the cup down again. And you watch officers learn how to carry authority. He paused. Some learn the right lessons. I didn't say anything. And some, Harding continued quietly, do not. He never said Briggs's name again. But he didn't need to. Harding folded his hands together on the desk. Leadership, he said, is not about control. No, sir. It is about responsibility. His voice remained calm, but there was something firm behind the words, something built from experience rather than theory. You would be surprised, he continued, how many officers confuse those two ideas. I believed him. Harding leaned forward slightly. Do you know why I travel the way I do sometimes? To observe units without ceremony, sir. Yes. He nodded once. When soldiers know a general is visiting, everything changes. Yes, sir. Floors are polished twice. Reports become immaculate. Conversations become rehearsed. I had seen that happen many times myself. But that, Harding said, does not tell you how a unit actually functions. He rested his hands on the desk again. So occasionally I move quietly. The image of the gas station came back into my mind, the hot pavement, the hum of the coolers, the coins on the counter. The gas station was part of that visit, sir, I asked carefully. Harding chuckled softly. Not intentionally. He tapped the desk lightly. My driver had just dropped me off near the highway before checking us into the installation. I wanted coffee before heading to headquarters. So the credit card issue was quite real. For the first time since the meeting began, I allowed myself a small smile. Yes, sir. Harding studied me for a moment. You didn't hesitate, he said. No, sir. Why not? The same question again. I shrugged slightly. It seemed like the right thing to do. Harding nodded slowly. That is exactly the point. He leaned back again. Character, he said, reveals itself in small moments. I listened carefully. Moments when people believe no one important is watching. The room was quiet again. Outside the window, the American flag in the courtyard shifted gently in the breeze. In the army, Harding continued, rank tells people what authority you hold. He paused. But character tells them whether you deserve it. The sentence hung in the air. I thought about the motor pool. About the soldiers who had fallen quiet when Briggs walked into the room. About the way tension had crept into the unit during the past week. Yes, sir, I said. Harding reached into the folder again. This time he removed a single sheet of paper and slid it across the desk. Take a look. I picked it up. It was a formal memorandum bearing the division letterhead. At the top was my name. The document recognized professional conduct, integrity, and respect for fellow service members. I looked up. Sir. Harding raised one hand gently. This is not a reward for buying someone a hot dog. I nodded. Yes, sir. It is recognition for something more important. He leaned forward slightly. The Army needs leaders who understand respect. Yes, sir. Not just respect upward for rank. He tapped the desk lightly. But respect for the soldiers who stand beside you. I folded the paper carefully and placed it back on the desk. Thank you, sir. Harding nodded. You're welcome. Then he asked a question I hadn't expected. Do you intend to remain in the Army long-term, Staff Sergeant? I considered the answer honestly. Yes, sir. He smiled faintly. Good. Harding stood slowly from his chair. Despite his age, the movement carried the steady balance of someone who had spent decades in uniform. I stood as well. When you eventually move into higher responsibility, he said, remember today. Yes, sir. Remember how leadership feels from the perspective of the people underneath it. I nodded. Yes, sir. Harding extended his hand. For a brief second I hesitated, not because I didn't want to shake it, but because enlisted soldiers don't often find themselves shaking hands with 4-star generals in quiet offices. But he waited patiently. So I shook it. His grip was firm. Keep doing the small things right, Harding said. Yes, sir. Because in the end, he added, those are the things that build the Army we are proud to serve in. He released my hand. You're dismissed, Staff Sergeant Carter. Yes, sir. I stepped out into the hallway. The base looked exactly the same as it had an hour earlier. Soldiers moving between buildings. Vehicles crossing the motor pool. Radios crackling. Routine continuing. But something had changed for me. Because that afternoon I had seen what real leadership looked like. And it did not come from paperwork. It came from character. A few weeks passed after that meeting, and life at the installation slowly settled back into something that felt closer to normal. The Army has a way of absorbing events, big ones and small ones, into its rhythm. Even significant leadership changes eventually fade into the background once the machinery of daily operations resumes its steady movement. Colonel Briggs never returned to the motor pool. Officially, the command review remained confidential. That's how the Army usually handles things when senior leadership needs to evaluate one of its own. Rumors circulated. Of course, soldiers are very good at speculation, but most of the details stayed behind closed doors where they belonged. What mattered most for the rest of us was simpler. The tension that had hung over the unit for weeks quietly lifted. The new acting operations officer handled problems the way experienced leaders often do: direct conversation, first paperwork, only when truly necessary. Maintenance teams worked with the same precision as before, but the constant feeling of being watched for minor mistakes disappeared. Conversations in the motor pool slowly returned. Laughter, too. One afternoon, Morales leaned against the dispatch desk and shook his head slightly. "Strange how things change overnight," he said. "Leadership does that," I replied. He nodded. "Yeah," he said, "the good kind does." Work continued. Convoys still needed scheduling. Vehicle inspections still happened every morning. Equipment logs still had to be accurate down to the smallest detail. The Army didn't lower its standards just because a leadership review had occurred. But the atmosphere felt different. Sometimes leadership doesn't require speeches. Sometimes it just requires fairness. Late one Friday afternoon, after finishing the week's readiness reports, I found myself driving down the same service road outside Dallas where the gas station sat. The sun was lower than it had been that day weeks earlier, casting long shadows across the dry grass along the roadside. Texas wind moved lightly through the fields, carrying the faint smell of dust and summer heat. I hadn't planned the stop consciously. But when the familiar faded sign appeared ahead, I turned into the parking lot almost automatically. The place looked exactly the same. A few pickup trucks parked near the entrance. The ice machine rattling softly beside the building, and the low hum of traffic from the highway in the distance. Inside, the fluorescent lights buzzed quietly overhead. The same roller grill turned slowly near the counter, hot dogs rotating beneath the heat lamps. Marissa was working the register again. When she looked up and recognized me, she smiled. "Well, look who's back," she said. "Yes, ma'am. Been a while." "Work's been busy." She poured a cup of coffee without even asking. "Army busy or paperwork busy?" she asked. I smiled slightly. "Both." I took the coffee and leaned against the counter. "You remember the older veteran who was here a few weeks ago?" I asked. Marissa's face brightened immediately. "Oh, the one you helped." "Yes, ma'am." She laughed softly. "Funny thing about that." "What happened?" "Well," she said, wiping the counter with a towel, "he came back the next morning." "He did." "Sat right there." She pointed toward the stool near the register. "What for?" "Breakfast." I nodded. "That sounds about right." She grinned. "But before he left, he asked about you." "About me?" "Your name, what unit you might be with, how often soldiers stop here." I took a slow sip of coffee. And then he paid for every soldier's breakfast who came through the door that morning." I blinked. "He did?" "Sure did." She chuckled again. "Never made a big deal about it either. Just told me to keep the grill running." That sounded exactly like something General Harding would do. Quiet. Simple. Respectful. Marissa leaned slightly on the counter. "You know who he was, don't you?" "Yes, ma'am." "Well," she said with a grin, "I looked it up later when the news mentioned a general visiting the base nearby." She shook her head slowly. 4 stars. "Yes, ma'am." And here I thought he was just another old soldier passing through. In a way, I said he was. She laughed softly and went back to ringing up a customer at the other register. I took my coffee and sat in one of the small booths by the window. Outside, the Texas sky had begun shifting into the soft orange light that comes before sunset. Cars moved slowly along the highway. A truck pulled into the lot, gravel crunching beneath its tires. For a few minutes I sat there quietly thinking about the strange chain of events that had started right there on that same floor. A man counting coins. A dollar bill on the counter. A meeting in a headquarters office. And a lesson about leadership that I would probably carry with me long after my time in uniform ended. The Army teaches you many things. How to endure difficult conditions. How to rely on the soldiers beside you. How to maintain discipline even when no one is watching. But sometimes the most important lessons come from moments so small they almost pass unnoticed. A quiet decision. A simple gesture. A choice to treat someone with respect even when the world around you is busy pretending not to notice. Because the truth is, you never really know who might be watching. And more importantly, you never know how far a single moment of character might travel. So if this story meant something to you, if it reminded you of a moment in your own life when a small act of kindness changed more than you expected, I'd truly love to hear about it. Leave a comment and tell me where you're watching from. And if you enjoy stories like this, stories about character leadership and the quiet moments that shape who we become, consider subscribing so you don't miss the next one. There are many more stories like this waiting to be told. Until next time, take care of the people around you. And remember that even the smallest act of respect can echo farther than you ever imagine.